The bitter wind cut through Margaret Riley's thin wool cloak like 1,000 tiny knives as she stumbled along the frozen dirt road leading away from Fort Stockton, Texas. Her eyes blurred with tears that threatened to freeze on her cheeks. She had been walking for nearly an hour since Thomas Lancaster had told her in front of half the town that he would not be marrying her after all, that his family had found someone more suitable, someone whose father had not lost everything in a failed cattle drive, and whose reputation had not been tarnished by association with bankruptcy and shame. The January cold of 1878 was particularly brutal this year, and Margaret had foolishly believed that her wedding day would bring warmth and security. But instead, she found herself cast out into the merciless winter with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a heart shattered into more pieces than she could count. The sky above had turned the color of slate, promising snow before nightfall, and Margaret knew she should turn back toward town, should swallow her pride and beg for shelter from someone, anyone, but the humiliation burned hotter than any fire could warm her. She had seen the pitying looks, heard the whispered comments about how Thomas had always been too good for her anyway, how her father's failures had finally caught up with the whole family. Her mother had passed 3 years ago from fever, and her father had drunk himself to death just 6 months past, leaving Margaret alone in a world that seemed determined to remind her exactly how little value a woman without family, without money, without prospects held in this harsh land. She pressed forward, though she had no destination in mind, her feet moving mechanically while her mind replayed every terrible moment of the morning. Thomas had not even had the decency to tell her privately. He had announced it at the mercantile, where she had gone to pick up the lace she had ordered for her wedding dress, the dress she had spent 3 months sewing by candlelight, the dress that now hung uselessly in the tiny room she rented above the laundry. The shopkeeper had looked away in embarrassment while Thomas explained in his careful, measured voice that circumstances had changed, that his family expected him to marry Caroline Whitmore, whose father owned the bank and half the businesses in Fort Stockton. Margaret had not cried then. She had stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, while Thomas turned and walked away as though he had just concluded a minor business transaction. It was only when she stepped outside into the brutal cold that the tears came, hot and shameful, streaming down her face as the full weight of her situation crashed down upon her. She was 21 years old, alone in the world, with barely enough money to pay for another week's rent, and the only man who had ever shown interest in marrying her had just announced to the entire town that she was not good enough. The road stretched ahead of her, winding through the sparse winter landscape of West Texas, where the ground was hard as iron, and the few trees that managed to survive stood bare and skeletal against the gray sky. Margaret pulled her cloak tighter, though it did little good against the penetrating cold. Her fingers had gone numb inside her thin gloves, and she could no longer feel her toes in her worn boots. Some distant part of her mind recognized that she was in danger, that she should turn back, but a larger part of her simply did not care anymore. What was the point of going back? To face the whispers and the pity? To scrub other people's laundry until her hands bled and her back bent like an old woman's? To die alone and unmourned in a rented room that smelled of lye soap and desperation? The first snowflakes began to fall, light and delicate at first, dancing on the wind like tiny white butterflies. Margaret watched them land on the dark fabric of her cloak, each one perfect and crystalline for just a moment before melting away into nothing. She understood exactly how they felt. The snow began to fall more heavily, and the wind picked up, howling across the open land with a sound like wolves crying in the distance. Margaret stumbled, her foot catching on a frozen rut in the road, and nearly fell. She caught herself, but the effort sent a wave of exhaustion through her body so profound that she wanted nothing more than to simply lie down and let the snow cover her like a blanket. She had gone perhaps 3 miles from town when she realized she could no longer see the road clearly. The snow was falling so thickly now that it obscured everything more than a few feet ahead, and the wind had picked up to a roar that drowned out all other sound. Margaret's teeth chattered violently, and her whole body shook with cold that had seeped deep into her bones. She tried to turn back toward Fort Stockton, but the wind pushed against her with such force that she staggered sideways, disoriented and dizzy. Fear began to cut through the numbness in her mind. She was going to die out here. She was going to freeze to death on this empty road because she had been too proud and too hurt to swallow her shame and go back to town while she still could. Margaret forced herself to keep moving, though she was no longer certain which direction she was headed. The world had become nothing but white snow and gray sky and the endless, punishing wind. Her legs felt like lead weights, each step requiring more effort than the last. She fell once, then twice, each time struggling back to her feet with increasing difficulty. The third time she fell, she was not sure she had the strength to rise again. The snow was already accumulating on the ground, soft and cold beneath her, and part of her whispered that it would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the cold take her away from all the pain and disappointment and loneliness. But something in Margaret Riley refused to give up. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps it was simple animal survival instinct, but she planted her hands in the snow and pushed herself upright once more. She took one step, then another, each one a small victory over the cold and the wind and the part of her that wanted to surrender. She had no idea how long she walked like that, locked in a battle with herself and the elements, aware only of the need to keep moving, to take one more step, and then one more after that. It was through this wall of white that she first saw the light. At first she thought she was hallucinating, that her frozen mind was conjuring mirages of warmth and safety. But as she stumbled forward, the light grew stronger, more defined. It was a window, glowing golden in the storm, and beyond it she could make out the dark shape of a building. A cabin, she realized, set back from the road in a small clearing. Smoke rose from the chimney, torn sideways by the wind but unmistakable evidence of fire and warmth within. Margaret tried to run toward it, but her legs would not obey. She managed a stumbling walk, falling twice more before she reached the wooden door. She raised her hand to knock, but her frozen fingers could barely make a sound against the heavy wood. She tried again, hitting harder, desperation giving her strength she did not know she possessed. The door opened so suddenly that she nearly fell forward into the arms of the man standing there. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark hair that fell across his forehead, and eyes the color of smoke that widened in surprise at the sight of her. "Good Lord," he said, his voice deep and rough with concern. He reached out and caught her before she could fall, his hands strong and sure as they steadied her. "You are frozen half to death. Come in quickly." He pulled her inside and shut the door against the howling wind. The warmth of the cabin hit Margaret like a physical force, and she gasped, her body beginning to shake even more violently as the heat met the cold that had settled deep within her. The man guided her to a chair near the fireplace, where flames crackled and danced, throwing orange light across the simple but well-kept interior of the cabin. Margaret could see little beyond the immediate area around the fire, her vision swimming and her mind struggling to process what was happening. "We need to get you warm," the man said, his voice calm but urgent. He disappeared for a moment and returned with a thick blanket, which he wrapped around her shoulders over her wet cloak. "How long were you out in that storm? What on earth were you doing out there?" Margaret tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form words. I was walking. I did not realize. The storm. "Do not try to talk yet," he said. He knelt in front of her and began unlacing her boots with efficient movements. "These are soaked through. We need to get them off before you lose your toes to frostbite." He removed her boots gently, and Margaret saw that her stockings were wet as well, her feet pale and bloodless looking in the firelight. The man disappeared again and came back with thick wool socks and another blanket. He wrapped her feet carefully, his touch impersonal but kind, and propped them up on a small stool near the fire. "Stay there," he instructed. "I am going to make you something hot to drink." He moved to the other side of the cabin, and Margaret heard the sounds of him working, metal clanking against metal, liquid pouring. She sat huddled in the blankets, gradually becoming aware of her surroundings as the violent shaking began to subside into mere trembling. The cabin was a single large room with a sleeping area in one corner, a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and various items that spoke of a man who lived alone but kept his space orderly. Saddles and tack hung on one wall, and she could see a rifle mounted above the door. The man returned with a tin cup filled with something that steamed in the cool air. "Coffee with a bit of whiskey," he said, pressing the cup into her hands and closing her fingers around it. "Drink it slowly. It will help warm you from the inside." Margaret took a tentative sip and felt the hot liquid burn its way down her throat, spreading warmth through her chest. She took another sip, and another, feeling the whiskey kindle a small fire in her belly. Slowly, sensation began to return to her extremities, bringing with it a painful tingling that made her gasp. "I know it hurts," the man said, watching her with those steady gray eyes. "That is actually a good sign. It means you are thawing out." He settled into the other chair, giving her space but staying close enough to help if needed. "I am Samuel Vaughn. This is my land, such as it is. Who are you, and what brought you out into a blizzard with nothing but a thin cloak?" Margaret took another sip of the coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her, feeling her mind begin to clear. "Margaret Riley," she said, her voice hoarse but stronger now. I left Fort Stockton. I was not paying attention to the weather." Samuel studied her for a long moment, his eyes seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "Fort Stockton is a good 3 miles back down that road. You came a fair distance in this storm. Most people would have turned back when the snow started." "I did not want to go back," Margaret said, and then, to her horror, felt tears welling up in her eyes again. She blinked them back fiercely, but one escaped, rolling down her cheek. She turned her face away, mortified. Here she was, imposing on a stranger's hospitality, and now she was crying like a child. Samuel did not comment on her tears. Instead, he stood and went to the stove, ladling something from a pot into a bowl. He brought it back and handed it to her. "Venison stew," he said. "You need food as much as warmth. When did you last eat?" Margaret had to think about it. "Yesterday evening," she admitted. She had been too nervous to eat breakfast, too excited about the final preparations for her wedding, the wedding that had never happened. She took the bowl and spoon he offered and began to eat, surprised by how hungry she was once she started. The stew was simple but good, rich with meat and vegetables, seasoned with salt and herbs. Samuel returned to his chair and watched the fire, giving her privacy to eat and compose herself. The storm raged outside, wind shrieking around the corners of the cabin and battering against the walls, but inside it was warm and safe. Margaret finished the stew and set the bowl aside, pulling the blankets more tightly around herself. She felt human again, no longer a frozen automaton stumbling through the snow. And with that return to herself came a crushing wave of humiliation. What must this man think of her, appearing on his doorstep like a half-frozen beggar, with no reasonable explanation for being out in a blizzard? "Thank you," she said quietly. "You saved my life. I would have died out there." Samuel turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You would have," he agreed with no false modesty. "What happened in Fort Stockton that made you walk out into that storm, Margaret Riley?" She hesitated, not wanting to speak the words aloud, not wanting to relive the humiliation. But he had saved her life, had shown her nothing but kindness, and she owed him the truth. "I was supposed to be married today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The man I was engaged to changed his mind. He told me this morning in front of half the town that his family had found someone more suitable, someone from a better family, with more money." Samuel's jaw tightened, and something that looked like anger flashed in his eyes. "He announced this publicly, not even in private, at the Mercantile," Margaret said, staring at her hands. "I think he wanted to make sure everyone knew it was his choice, that he was rejecting me, not the other way around. My father died 6 months ago, leaving nothing but debts. My mother passed 3 years before that. I have no family, no money, no prospects. Thomas Lancaster decided I was not worth the trouble." "Thomas Lancaster," Samuel repeated, his voice flat. "The banker's son." Margaret looked up in surprise. "You know him?" "I know of him," Samuel said. "I have had dealings with his father. The apple does not fall far from the tree, it seems. They are the sort of people who measure a person's worth in dollars and cents." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes intent on her face. "But that does not explain why you walked out into a blizzard instead of going to a friend, or to the church, or anywhere with shelter." Margaret laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "I have no friends in Fort Stockton. I have acquaintances, people I do laundry for, people who are polite to my face and whisper behind my back about my father's failures and my family's shame. I rent a room above the laundry, and I work 6 days a week washing other people's dirty clothes until my hands crack and bleed. I thought marrying Thomas would change that. I thought it would give me a home, a future, maybe children someday. I thought it would mean I would not die alone and forgotten in that miserable little room." She stopped, appalled at herself for saying so much, for revealing so much of her desperation and loneliness to this stranger. But Samuel did not look shocked or disgusted. Instead, his expression had softened, and he nodded slowly as though he understood exactly what she meant. "I came to Texas 5 years ago," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I had nothing but my horse, my saddle, and $10 in my pocket. I worked cattle drives, broke horses, did whatever work I could find until I saved enough to buy this land and build this cabin. I know what it is to have nothing, to be alone, to wonder if this is all there is." He paused, then added, "But I also know that being alone is better than being with someone who does not value you. Thomas Lancaster rejecting you might be the best thing that could have happened, even if it does not feel that way right now." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to defend her shattered plans, but found she could not. Deep down, in a place she had not wanted to acknowledge, she knew that her engagement to Thomas had been built on desperation rather than love. She had agreed to marry him because he offered security, because she was terrified of being alone, not because her heart leaped when she saw him, or because she could imagine growing old by his side. "What am I supposed to do now?" she asked, and heard the lost quality in her own voice. "I cannot go back to Fort Stockton. I cannot face the pity, the whispers. Everyone knows I was rejected, that I was not good enough." "You are more than good enough," Samuel said with such conviction that Margaret looked up at him in surprise. "Any man who cannot see your worth is a fool. As for what you do now, first you stay here until this storm passes. It is not safe to go anywhere until the weather clears. After that, well, we can figure that out together." The casual way he said "together" made something warm unfurl in Margaret's chest, something entirely separate from the physical warmth of the fire and the food. She studied Samuel Vaughn in the flickering firelight, really looking at him for the first time. He was probably in his late 20s, with strong features and the weathered skin of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a working man, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. There was a quiet strength about him, a steadiness that Thomas had never possessed. The storm continued through the night, snow piling against the walls of the cabin and wind howling like something alive and hungry. Samuel gave Margaret his bed, insisting over her protests that he was perfectly comfortable sleeping in his chair by the fire. She was too exhausted to argue for long, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep wrapped in warm blankets, safe from the cold for the first time in hours. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying. Gray morning light filtered through the cabin windows, and the roar of the wind had subsided to a gentle whisper. Margaret sat up, momentarily disoriented, and then remembered where she was and why. She felt a rush of embarrassment at having imposed on Samuel's hospitality, at having broken down in front of him. But when she emerged from behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the rest of the cabin, he greeted her with a smile that held no judgment. "The storm has passed," he said, gesturing toward the window. "But the snow is deep. It will be a day or two before the roads are passable enough to travel safely." Margaret moved to the window and looked out at a transformed landscape. Everything was covered in white. The snow drifted in places as high as the cabin windows. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder of how close she had come to death. "I am sorry for the trouble I have caused you," she said, turning back to Samuel. "You must think I am completely foolish." "I think you were hurt and not thinking clearly," Samuel said, turning the bacon in the pan. "I think you made a mistake in judgment, but that does not make you foolish. It makes you human." He plated the bacon and fried eggs, setting them on the table with fresh coffee. "Come eat. We can talk about what comes next." They sat across from each other at the small table, and Margaret found herself studying him again, noticing details she had missed in her frozen, traumatized state the night before. The way his hair curled slightly at his collar, the small scar that ran through his left eyebrow, the careful, deliberate way he moved, as though every action was considered and purposeful. "You said you have been here 5 years," Margaret said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you work cattle?" "I have a small herd," Samuel said. 30 head right now, though I am hoping to increase that this year. I also break and train horses, which brings in steady money. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to live on, enough to build something with." He took a sip of his coffee. "What about you? What did you do before working at the laundry?" "I helped my mother when she was alive," Margaret said. "She took in sewing, and I learned from her. After she died, I kept doing it for a while, but there was not enough work to support myself. The laundry was the only place that would hire me." She paused, then added, "I am good with a needle. I made my own wedding dress before." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Samuel reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, the gesture brief but warm. "Their rejection led you straight to my heart," he said softly. "If Thomas Lancaster had married you, you would not have been walking down that road yesterday. You would not have ended up here. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually blessings in disguise, pushing us toward where we are supposed to be." Margaret felt her breath catch at his words, at the implication behind them. You barely know me, she whispered. I know enough, Samuel said, his gray eyes holding hers. I know you are strong enough to survive a blizzard, brave enough to walk away from a situation that made you unhappy, and honest enough to speak the truth even when it hurts. I know that you have been dealt a hard hand by life, but you have not let it make you bitter or cruel. And I know that when I opened my door last night and saw you standing there, half frozen and terrified, something inside me shifted. I cannot explain it any better than that. Margaret stared at him, her heart beating fast in her chest. This was madness. She had known this man for less than a day. And yet, there was something in his words, in the way he looked at her, that called to something deep inside her, something that had never responded to Thomas despite a 6-month engagement. I do not want you to feel obligated, she said carefully. You saved my life, and I am grateful, but I do not want you to think you have to take care of me or offer me something out of pity. Samuel shook his head firmly. This is not pity. If it were just pity, I would offer to loan you money for a stage ticket to San Antonio or El Paso, somewhere you could start fresh. But that is not what I want to offer you. He took a breath, and Margaret saw vulnerability in his face for the first time. I have been alone for 5 years. I told myself I was content with that I did not need anyone else. But the truth is, I have been lonely. This cabin is too quiet, this life is too solitary, and I have been looking for someone to share it with. Not just anyone. Someone who understands what it is to struggle, to fight for survival, to build something from nothing. Someone who does not measure worth in money or social standing. Someone like me, Margaret said, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Exactly like you, Samuel confirmed. He stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. I am not saying we need to rush into anything. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, but I am asking you to stay. Stay here, get to know me, let me get to know you. If after a while you decide this is not what you want, I will help you get wherever you need to go. But if you stay, if you give this a chance, I think we could build something good together. Something real. Margaret looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity there, nothing but honest hope. She thought about the alternative, about going back to Fort Stockton and her tiny room above the laundry, about the whispers and the pity, about spending the rest of her life washing other people's clothes and dying alone and unmourned. Then she thought about staying here, in this warm cabin with this steady, kind man who looked at her like she was valuable, like she mattered. I will stay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would like to give this a chance. The smile that broke across Samuel's face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He reached up and cupped her cheek gently with one calloused hand. You will not regret this, he said. I promise you that. The days that followed were unlike anything Margaret had experienced before. The snow kept them confined to the cabin and its immediate surroundings for 3 days, but rather than feeling trapped, Margaret found herself relaxing into a rhythm of life that felt natural and right. Samuel taught her how he liked his coffee, and she showed him a better way to fold his shirts. They cooked meals together, washed dishes side by side, and spent long evenings talking by the fire. Samuel told her about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 5 boys, and how he had headed west after his parents died, seeking a fresh start in a place where no one knew him or his family. Margaret told him about her childhood in Fort Worth, about moving to Fort Stockton after her father's cattle drive failed, about the slow slide from respectability into poverty, and the constant weight of trying to maintain appearances when you had nothing left to maintain them with. They discovered shared interests and complementary differences. Both loved reading, though Samuel preferred histories and accounts of exploration, while Margaret favored novels and poetry. Samuel was an early riser who liked to be active, while Margaret was naturally inclined to stay up late and sleep in, but they found they could adapt to each other's rhythms. Samuel was quiet and thoughtful, taking his time to process his thoughts before speaking, while Margaret was more impulsive and emotional, but she found his steadiness calming rather than frustrating. On the fourth day after Margaret's arrival, the sun came out bright and strong, beginning the work of melting the snow. Samuel bundled up and went out to check on his horses, which he had secured in the small barn before the storm hit. Margaret insisted on coming with him, and together they waded through snow that came up to their knees in places. The horses were all fine, hungry and eager for attention, but unharmed by the storm. Margaret watched as Samuel checked each one carefully, running his hands over their legs and bodies, speaking to them in a low, gentle voice. She saw the care he took with the animals, the way they responded to him with trust, and it told her volumes about the kind of man he was. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Samuel reached out and took her hand. It was not the first time he had touched her since that first morning, but this felt different, more deliberate. "Margaret," he said, his voice serious, "I need to tell you something. I need you to understand what kind of life you would have here if you choose to stay long term." Margaret's heart sank a little. Was he having second thoughts? Was he about to tell her this had all been a mistake? But she kept her expression calm and said, "I am listening." "This is not an easy life," Samuel said, his thumb rubbing small circles on the back of her hand. "I am not a wealthy man. I will never be wealthy. I work hard for what I have, and it is enough, but there will be no fancy dresses or jewelry, no big house in town, no servants or social events. There will be early mornings and long days, times when money is tight, times when the work is overwhelming. If we have children, you would be raising them out here, miles from town, without the convenience of neighbors close by or doctors readily available. Is that supposed to discourage me?" Margaret asked, a small smile playing at her lips. "Because if so, you should probably know that I have been living above a laundry, working 6 days a week for barely enough money to eat, with no prospects and no future. What you are describing sounds like paradise compared to that." Samuel laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I suppose when you put it that way. But I want you to really think about it, Margaret. I want you to be sure. Because once you commit to this life to me, I am going to do everything in my power to make sure you never regret it. I am going to build you the best life I can. It might not be much by some people's standards, but it will be ours, and it will be real." Margaret turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "I have thought about it," she said. "I have thought about little else for the past 4 days. And I am sure, Samuel, more sure than I have been about anything in my life. I do not want fancy dresses or big houses. I want a home. I want a partner. I want someone who sees me, really sees me, not just as a means to an end or a burden to be managed. You have given me more in 4 days than Thomas offered in 6 months. You have given me hope." Samuel pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her, and Margaret rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers, neither of them needing to speak. The connection between them was already growing, putting down roots that went deeper than Margaret would have thought possible in such a short time. The next morning, Samuel announced that the roads should be passable enough to make the trip into Fort Stockton. "You left things there," he said. "Your belongings, your dress, whatever else you have. We should retrieve them." Margaret felt anxiety tighten in her chest at the thought of going back to town, facing all those people who had witnessed her humiliation. But Samuel was right. She needed her things, and she needed to make it clear that she would not be returning to work at the laundry. "Will you come with me?" she asked. "Of course," Samuel said, as though there had never been any question. "We will take the wagon. We can load everything up at once and be done with it." The trip into Fort Stockton took nearly 2 hours over roads that were muddy and treacherous with melting snow. Samuel drove the wagon with easy competence, and Margaret sat beside him, growing more nervous the closer they got to town. When they finally arrived, people stopped and stared openly. Margaret could see the questions in their eyes, the speculation. Who was this man with Margaret Riley? Where had she been for the past several days? Rumors must have been flying, she realized, when she had not shown up for work and no one knew where she had gone. They stopped first at the laundry, where Mrs. Henderson came bustling out, her face a mixture of relief and irritation. "Margaret Riley, where on earth have you been? You missed 4 days of work without so much as a word. I had to do everything myself, and I have half a mind to dock your wages." "You do not need to worry about that, madam," Margaret said, climbing down from the wagon with Samuel's assistance. "I will not be returning to work here. I came to collect my belongings and settle my accounts." Mrs. Henderson's eyes went wide, darting between Margaret and Samuel. "Not returning? But where will you go? What will you do?" "That is my concern, not yours," Margaret said, with more confidence than she felt. "If you will give me the key to my room, I will gather my things and be out of your way." Mrs. Henderson sputtered for a moment, then thrust the key at Margaret with bad grace. "Well, I suppose I should have expected this. Young girls these days, no sense of responsibility, no understanding of loyalty." Samuel stepped forward, and though he did not say a word, his presence and the look on his face made Mrs. Henderson take a step back. "The key," he said quietly, and it was not a request. Margaret took the key and led the way up the narrow stairs to her room. It was even more depressing than she remembered, just a tiny space with a cot, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for her clothes. Her wedding dress hung there, the lace she had bought the day Thomas rejected her still in its paper wrapping on the bed. She had lived here for 8 months, and it had never once felt like home. Samuel helped her pack her meager belongings into the 2 bags she owned. There was not much. A few dresses, some undergarments, her mother's sewing box, a book of poems her father had given her years ago, and the wedding dress. Margaret hesitated over the dress, then carefully folded it and placed it in the bag. The lace could be used for something else, and the dress itself represented too many hours of work to simply abandon. They carried the bags down to the wagon, and Margaret returned the key to Mrs. Henderson, who accepted it with a sniff and immediately went back inside without another word. Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. One connection to her old life severed. Next, they stopped at the mercantile, where Margaret paid the few dollars she owed for the lace. The shopkeeper, Mr. Peters, was kinder than Mrs. Henderson had been. "I am glad to see you are all right, Miss Riley," he said. "There was some concern when you disappeared after all that unpleasantness with the Lancaster boy." "I am fine, Mr. Peters," Margaret said. "Better than fine, actually. Thank you for your kindness." They were loading the last of Margaret's purchases into the wagon when a voice called out, "Margaret! Margaret, wait!" Margaret turned to see Thomas Lancaster hurrying across the street toward them, his face flushed with exertion or emotion or both. Samuel tensed beside her, but Margaret put a hand on his arm. "It is all right," she said quietly. "Let me handle this." Thomas reached them, slightly out of breath. He glanced at Samuel with obvious curiosity and some wariness, then focused on Margaret. "Where have you been?" "People have been talking, saying you disappeared after our conversation. I was worried something had happened to you." "Something did happen to me," Margaret said, her voice calm and clear. "I walked out into a blizzard and nearly froze to death. But I was saved, and I found something much better than what I lost." Thomas blinked, clearly not understanding. "I wanted to apologize," he said, lowering his voice. "I know I handled things poorly. I should have spoken to you in private. My father insisted I make it clear that the engagement was ended, that there was no ambiguity, but I could have done it better." "Yes, you could have," Margaret agreed. "But honestly, Thomas, I am grateful you did it the way you did. If you had been kind about it, if you had let me down gently, I might have clung to hope that you would change your mind. I might have wasted more time waiting for something that was never going to happen. Your cruelty was actually a gift. It freed me to find what I was really looking for." Thomas's face flushed darker and his eyes flicked to Samuel again. "And what is that? Who is this man?" "This is Samuel Vaughn," Margaret said, and felt Samuel move closer to her side, his hand coming to rest on the small of her back. The gesture was possessive but not aggressive, a simple statement of connection. "He saved my life, and he has offered me a future that is worth having. A real future, not one based on convenience or social standing." "Margaret, be reasonable," Thomas said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "You barely know this man. How can you throw away everything for someone you just met?" "I am not throwing away anything," Margaret said. "I am choosing something. And that is the difference, Thomas. With you, I was settling for whatever scraps of security you deigned to offer. With Samuel, I am choosing a life that I want with a man who values me. You did me a favor by rejecting me, even if you did not mean to. You pushed me toward something better." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but Samuel spoke first, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "The lady has made her position clear," he said. "I think it is time we were on our way." Margaret let Samuel help her up onto the wagon seat, and as they pulled away, she did not look back. She felt no regret, no longing for what she had lost. Instead, she felt liberated, as though a weight she had been carrying for months had finally been lifted from her shoulders. They were almost out of town when Samuel reached over and took her hand. "You were magnificent," he said, a smile in his voice. "The way you stood up to him, the way you made it clear you had moved on. I was proud of you," Margaret laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "It felt good," she admitted. "I spent so long being afraid of what people thought, afraid of being alone, afraid of not being good enough. But none of that matters anymore. I have something real now. I have you." "You have me," Samuel agreed, "for as long as you want me." "Forever then," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "I am choosing forever." The weeks that followed settled into a pattern that Margaret found deeply satisfying. She took over the household duties, cooking and cleaning and mending, while Samuel worked with the horses and cattle. But it was not a rigid division of labor. Samuel often helped with dinner, and Margaret frequently went out to the barn to help with the animals, learning from him about their care and handling. They were building a partnership, not just maintaining separate spheres. Margaret unpacked her mother's sewing box and began taking in work from some of the ranches in the area. Word spread that there was a skilled seamstress living out at the Vaughn place, and soon she had a steady stream of commissions for shirts, trousers, even a few dresses. The money was good, and more importantly, it made her feel useful and productive, contributing to their life together in a tangible way. Samuel was patient with her, never pushing for physical intimacy beyond holding hands and the occasional kiss. Those kisses, though, left Margaret breathless and aching for more. Samuel kissed like he did everything else, with focus and intention, as though the only thing in the world that mattered was her mouth under his and the way she sighed against him. But he always pulled back before things went too far, reminding her that they had time, that there was no need to rush. "I want to marry you properly," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. "I want to do this right. I want you to have the wedding you deserve, not something rushed and secretive. Margaret was touched by his consideration, but she also knew what she wanted. "I do not need a fancy wedding," she said. "I just need you. We could go into town tomorrow and have the preacher marry us. That would be enough for me." Samuel turned to her, his eyes searching her face. "Are you sure? You would not rather wait, have time to make a new dress, plan something special, I am sure," Margaret said. She took his hand and placed it over her heart, letting him feel how fast it was beating. "I do not need time, Samuel. I know what I want. I want to be your wife. I want to start our life together, not keep waiting for some perfect moment that might never come." Samuel pulled her close and kissed her, and this time there was something different in it, something deeper and more intense. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. "Tomorrow, then," he said, his voice rough. "We will go into town tomorrow and get married." They rode into Fort Stockton the next morning, both dressed in their best clothes. Samuel wore a clean white shirt and vest, his dark hair combed back, looking every inch the respectable rancher. Margaret wore the wedding dress she had made for Thomas, but she had stayed up late the night before unpicking the lace and rearranging it, transforming the dress into something new, something that was hers alone. It felt right, taking something born of disappointment and reshaping it into something that represented hope and love. The preacher, Reverend Matthews, was a kind man in his 50s who asked no questions about the speed of their courtship or the circumstances that had brought them together. He simply smiled and agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon, giving them time to file the paperwork at the courthouse and gather the 2 witnesses required by law. They found their witnesses in an older couple who were at the church for a prayer meeting. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were ranchers from east of town, and they were delighted to stand up for the young couple, declaring it romantic that they were marrying for love rather than for land or money or family alliances. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church with afternoon sun streaming through the plain glass windows. There were no flowers, no music beyond Mrs. Thompson humming softly, no crowd of well-wishers. But when Samuel took Margaret's hands in his and spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish her for all the days of his life, Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears. These were not tears of sadness or disappointment, but of pure joy. This was nothing like the wedding she had planned with Thomas. This was better. This was real. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Samuel kissed her with such tenderness that Margaret thought her heart might burst. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not security or social standing, but this connection, this feeling of being truly seen and valued and loved. They signed the register, accepted the congratulations of the Thompsons and Reverend Matthews, and then Samuel helped Margaret up onto the wagon. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Vaughn?" he asked, his eyes warm with affection. "More than ready," Margaret said, loving the sound of her new name. Mrs. Vaughn. It felt right in a way that Mrs. Lancaster never would have. They stopped at the mercantile on the way out of town to stock up on supplies, and Mr. Peters congratulated them warmly. Word would spread quickly, Margaret knew, but she found she did not care what people thought or said. She had made her choice, and she was happy with it. The ride back to the ranch seemed to take forever, both of them aware that this night would be different from all the others they had spent under the same roof. When they finally arrived home, Samuel lifted Margaret down from the wagon, holding her for a moment longer than necessary before setting her on her feet. "I will take care of the horses," he said. "You go on inside. I will be in shortly." Margaret went into the cabin and lit the lamps, suddenly nervous. She had only the vaguest understanding of what happened between a man and woman on their wedding night, gleaned from whispered conversations and cryptic warnings. Her mother had never had the chance to tell her, dying before Margaret was old enough to marry. She changed out of her wedding dress into a simple cotton nightgown, then sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in her lap, waiting. When Samuel came in, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. "You are beautiful," he said softly. He came and sat beside her on the bed, taking her hand. "Are you afraid?" "A little," Margaret admitted. "I do not know what to expect." Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "Then let me tell you what to expect. I am going to touch you and kiss you and learn everything about what makes you sigh and tremble. I am going to be as gentle and patient as I need to be. And if at any point you want me to stop, you just have to say so and I will. This is about both of us, Margaret, about bringing each other pleasure and joy. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, feeling some of her nervousness ease. She trusted Samuel. She trusted him with her life, with her future, and she could trust him with this too. She leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her love and trust into that kiss, and Samuel responded with a gentleness that made her want to weep. What followed was a revelation. Samuel kept his promise, taking his time, showing her with hands and mouth and whispered words how much he desired her, how beautiful he found her. There was some pain, but it was brief, and Samuel held her through it, murmuring reassurances and apologies. And then there was pleasure, building and building until Margaret cried out, clinging to him as waves of sensation washed through her. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Samuel pressing kisses to her temple while she caught her breath. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice concerned. "I am better than all right," Margaret said, turning her face to kiss him. "That was wonderful." Samuel laughed softly. "It will get even better," he promised. "We have a lifetime to figure this out together." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, and Margaret thought she had never been so happy in her entire life. The months that followed were some of the best of Margaret's life. She and Samuel settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. They worked together during the day and made love at night, and gradually the cabin began to feel like a real home. Margaret planted a garden as soon as the weather warmed, growing vegetables and herbs. Samuel expanded the barn to accommodate more horses. They talked about the future, about adding more cattle, about maybe building a bigger house someday. In early May, Margaret realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be sure, then told Samuel one evening over dinner. "I think I am with child," she said, watching his face for his reaction. Samuel's eyes went wide, and then a grin spread across his face so broad and genuine that Margaret started laughing. He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "A baby," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, though she could already see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Samuel said. He set her down gently and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "We made this. A new life, born out of what we have built together. Of course I am happy." The pregnancy was not easy. Margaret suffered from sickness in the early months that left her weak and exhausted. Samuel took over most of the household duties without complaint, bringing her dry toast and weak tea, holding her hair back when she was sick, rubbing her feet when they swelled. He treated her like she was made of precious glass, which sometimes frustrated Margaret but mostly made her love him even more. As her belly grew, Samuel became even more protective. He did not want her lifting anything heavy or riding horses or doing anything that might put the baby at risk. Margaret argued that women had been having babies since the beginning of time while still doing their regular work, but Samuel was adamant. "This is our first child," he said. "I am not taking any chances." In late December, Nearly a year after Margaret had walked into the blizzard and found her way to Samuel's door, she went into labor. Samuel had arranged for a midwife from town to come stay with them for the last few weeks, and Mrs. Garcia proved to be a calm, competent presence during the long hours of labor. Samuel stayed by Margaret's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth, murmuring encouragement even when Margaret was sure she could not go on. Finally, after 14 hours of labor, their son came into the world with a loud, lusty cry. Mrs. Garcia cleaned him up and placed him in Margaret's arms, and Margaret looked down at the tiny, red, wrinkled face and felt such a surge of love that it took her breath away. "He is perfect," she whispered. Samuel leaned over to look at his son, and Margaret saw tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," he agreed. He kissed Margaret's forehead. Thank you for this gift." They named him Jacob, after Samuel's father, and he became the center of their world. Samuel was a devoted father, taking on the nighttime feedings so Margaret could rest, walking the floor with Jacob when he was fussy, singing to him in a low, slightly off-key voice that never failed to make Margaret smile. Watching Samuel with their son, Margaret fell in love with him all over again. Jacob was 6 months old when Margaret realized she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the fall of 1880 they welcomed a daughter whom they named Sarah, after Margaret's mother. Sarah was tiny and delicate where Jacob had been robust, but she had a will of iron from the moment she was born. Margaret saw herself in her daughter's determination, and she delighted in teaching her as she grew. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. Samuel's ranch prospered, growing from 30 head of cattle to over 100. He became known in the area as a fair dealer and an honest man, and his reputation for training horses spread far enough that people came from as far away as El Paso to purchase animals he had worked with. Margaret's sewing business continued to thrive, and she saved every penny, planning for the future and for the education of their children. When Jacob was 5 and Sarah was 3, they added another room to the cabin, giving the children their own space. When Margaret became pregnant with their 3rd child, Samuel began drawing up plans for a proper house, something bigger and more substantial. "We need more space," he said, "and I want to give you the home you deserve." "I already have the home I deserve," Margaret said, wrapping her arms around him from behind as he worked at the table. "A home filled with love and laughter and the people I care about. The size of the building does not matter." But Samuel built the house anyway, working on it in his spare time with help from neighbors who had become friends over the years. It was finished just before their 3rd child, another son they named Matthew, was born in the spring of 1883. The new house had 4 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, a dining room, and a parlor. Margaret made curtains for all the windows and braided rugs for the floors. She transplanted her garden to a sunnier spot and added more vegetables and flowers. The house became a gathering place for neighbors, a place of warmth and welcome where people knew they would be treated with kindness and fed well. Jacob grew into a serious boy who loved working with his father and the animals. Sarah was wild and fearless, always getting into trouble but charming her way out of it with her bright smile. Matthew was quiet and thoughtful, happiest when he was sitting with a book or helping his mother in the garden. Margaret and Samuel watched their children grow with pride and amazement, marveling at the different people they were becoming. In 1885, when Jacob was 7, Sarah 5, and Matthew 2, Margaret discovered she was pregnant yet again. This pregnancy was more difficult than the previous ones, and the birth was long and hard. When their daughter finally arrived, small but healthy, Margaret was exhausted but happy. They named her Emily, and she became the baby of the family, doted on by her older siblings and adored by her parents. As the children grew, Margaret sometimes thought back to that cold January day in 1878 when she had walked into a blizzard, heartbroken and hopeless. She thought about Thomas Lancaster and his rejection, and she felt nothing but gratitude. Thomas had unknowingly given her the greatest gift of her life by setting her free. She had heard through the town gossip that he had married Caroline Whitmore and that they lived in a big house in town, childless and formal, hosting dinners for the socially prominent families. Margaret did not envy her that life for even a moment. Samuel noticed her thoughtful expression one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while the children played in the yard. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, reaching over to take her hand. "About how lucky I am," Margaret said. "About how a moment that felt like the worst thing that had ever happened to me turned out to be the best. About how their rejection led me straight to your heart." Samuel smiled, that warm, genuine smile that still made Margaret's heart skip a beat even after all these years. "I am the lucky one," he said. "I was alone in that cabin, telling myself I was content, when really I was just existing. And then you stumbled out of a blizzard and into my life, and everything changed. You gave me a family, Margaret. You gave me a reason to build something bigger than just a life for myself." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their children play. Jacob was teaching Sarah how to rope a fence post, while Matthew sat in the grass making chains out of wildflowers, and baby Emily toddled between them all, laughing at everything. This was her life. This was what she had found on the other side of rejection and loss. Not just survival, but joy. Not just security, but love. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new blessings. There were droughts and storms, sickness and injury, times when money was tight and times when the work seemed overwhelming. But through it all, Margaret and Samuel faced everything together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. Jacob grew into a young man much like his father, steady and reliable, with a gift for working with horses. He took over more and more of the ranch work as he got older, allowing Samuel to slow down a bit. Sarah remained spirited and independent, shocking everyone when she announced at 16 that she wanted to be a teacher and intended to go to the normal school in San Antonio. Samuel was hesitant, worried about his daughter going so far away, but Margaret supported Sarah's ambitions, remembering what it felt like to have your dreams dismissed. Matthew grew into a quiet scholar, his room filled with books, talking about becoming a lawyer someday. And Emily was still young, but already showing signs of having inherited her mother's skill with a needle and her father's head for business. In 1895, 17 years after that fateful blizzard, Margaret stood in the kitchen of their home, preparing dinner for their family. She was 44 years old now, with strands of gray in her dark hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the sun. Her hands were no longer smooth but calloused from work, her body softened from bearing 4 children. But when Samuel came in from the barn and wrapped his arms around her from behind, kissing the back of her neck, she felt as young and beautiful as she had on their wedding day. "I love you, Margaret Vaughn," he murmured against her skin. "And I love you, Samuel Vaughn," she replied, turning in his arms to kiss him properly. "Today and always." That evening, the whole family gathered around the dinner table in the dining room they had added onto the house 5 years before. Jacob had brought his new wife, a sweet girl named Anna from a neighboring ranch. Sarah was home from school for the summer, full of stories about her studies and her plans. Matthew was talking excitedly about a case he had read about in the newspaper. Emily was chattering about the dress she was sewing for the church social. The table was full of food and laughter and love, exactly as Margaret had always dreamed a family should be. After dinner, after the children had dispersed to their various activities, Margaret and Samuel walked out to the porch to watch the sunset, as they had done countless times over the years. The land stretched out before them, golden in the fading light, and Margaret could see the barn and corrals, the cattle grazing peacefully, the garden she tended with such care. Everything they had built together. "You ever regret it?" Samuel asked suddenly. "Walking away from town, from the chance at a different kind of life?" Margaret laughed and turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, this man who had given her everything that truly mattered. "Not for a single moment," she said. "That day I walked into the blizzard, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything, but I had not lost anything. I just had not found the right thing yet." "And did you find it?" Samuel asked, though his eyes told her he already knew the answer. "I found it," Margaret confirmed. "I found you. I found home. I found love. Everything else is just details." Samuel pulled her close, and they stood together watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Behind them, through the open windows, they could hear their children's voices, the sounds of life and family and continuity. This was their legacy, Margaret thought. Not wealth or status or social position, but this. Love that had grown from rejection and desperation into something strong and enduring. A family built on choice and commitment and the willingness to take a chance on each other. The years continued to march on, as they always do. Jacob and Anna had 3 children of their own, giving Margaret and Samuel the joy of grandchildren. Sarah finished her education and took a teaching position at the school in Fort Stockton, eventually marrying a fellow teacher and having 2 children. Matthew became a lawyer as he had planned, setting up practice in El Paso but coming home to visit several times a year. Emily married at 20, settling on a ranch just 10 miles away, close enough to visit often. Samuel's hair turned completely gray, and he moved more slowly than he once had, but his eyes were still sharp, and his love for Margaret as strong as ever. Margaret's hands became arthritic, making sewing difficult, but she found joy in teaching her granddaughters the skills her own mother had taught her. They were growing old together, exactly as they had promised on their wedding day. In 1903, 25 years after that January blizzard, Samuel and Margaret celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. Their children arranged a party at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends from all over the area. The house was packed with people, the tables groaning under the weight of food, and there was music and dancing and speeches. Jacob stood up and told the story of how his parents met, embellishing it slightly for dramatic effect, and everyone laughed and raised their glasses to toast the couple. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she stood beside Samuel, her hand in his, and looked out at all the faces gathered to celebrate with them. She saw her children and grandchildren, saw the community they had become part of, saw the life they had built from nothing but hope and hard work and love. 25 years ago, she said, her voice strong and clear, I thought my life was ending. I thought I had been rejected, cast aside, deemed not good enough. But what I learned that day and every day since is that sometimes rejection is redirection. Sometimes what feels like the worst thing that can happen is actually the universe pushing you toward the best thing. Thomas Lancaster's rejection led me straight to Samuel's heart, and I would not change a single moment of what followed. She looked down at Samuel, who was looking back at her with such love and pride that she felt tears prick her eyes. This man saved my life, not just from the blizzard, but from a future that would have been empty and hollow. He gave me everything that matters. He gave me himself, freely and completely. And he gave me this life, this family, this home. So today I want to say thank you, not just to Samuel, but to everyone here who has been part of our journey. You have all contributed to making our life something worth celebrating. The party went on late into the night, and when it was finally over and everyone had gone home, Margaret and Samuel sat together on their porch, tired but happy. 25 years, Samuel mused. It has gone so fast. And yet it feels like I have known you forever, Margaret said. Like I was always meant to find you, even if the path there was difficult. I am grateful for every day, Samuel said. Every moment with you has been a gift. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one, holding hands as they had done for a quarter of a century. The future stretched ahead of them still, full of unknown challenges and joys, but they would face it together, as they always had in the end. Margaret Riley, who became Margaret Vaughn, learned that the end of one story was simply the beginning of another, better one. She learned that rejection could be a gift, that pain could lead to joy, and that love could be found in the most unexpected places. She learned that home was not a place but a person, and that family was built not just by blood but by choice and commitment and the willingness to show up every day and do the work of loving each other. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled around their house and snow fell softly outside, Margaret would snuggle close to Samuel in their warm bed and remember that long-ago blizzard that had nearly killed her, but instead had led her to everything she had ever really wanted. She would think about the cowboy who had opened his door to a half-frozen stranger and offered not just shelter but a future, and she would whisper into the darkness, "Thank you. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for loving me." And Samuel, half asleep but always attuned to her, would tighten his arms around her and murmur back, "Always. I will always choose you." The years rolled on into the new century, and Margaret and Samuel grew old together with grace and gratitude. They watched their children become adults, watched their grandchildren grow, and eventually welcomed great-grandchildren. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. A legacy of love and hard work and the courage to take a chance on each other. When Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Margaret mourned him deeply, but found comfort in knowing they had lived a full life together. She stayed on at the ranch, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories about the man who had saved her from a blizzard and given her a love that lasted a lifetime. And when Margaret herself passed away 3 years later, at the age of 74, her children found among her things a carefully preserved wedding dress, altered from its original design, and a letter she had written to be read after her death. In it, she told the full story of that January day in 1878, of Thomas Lancaster's rejection and her walk into the blizzard, of Samuel opening his door and offering her not just shelter but hope. She wrote about how the worst day of her life had become the best, how rejection had led her to a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. "Do not be afraid when things fall apart," she wrote. "Do not despair when doors close in your face. Sometimes rejection is simply redirection, pushing you toward something better, something you could not see from where you were standing. Trust that there is a plan, even when you cannot see it. Trust that love will find you, even in the coldest blizzard. And when it does, do not hesitate. Choose love. Choose courage. Choose to build something beautiful with the person who sees you for who you really are. That is the secret to a life well lived." The letter was read aloud at her funeral, held in the church in Fort Stockton where she and Samuel had been married all those years ago. There was not a dry eye in the congregation as her children shared their mother's story. This tale of rejection and redemption, of loss and love, of a woman who had walked into a blizzard expecting to die and instead had found everything worth living for. Margaret and Samuel were buried side by side in the small cemetery outside Fort Stockton, their headstones simple but elegant, bearing the dates of their births and deaths, and a single inscription that summed up their entire story. It reads simply, "Their rejection led you straight to my heart." The words Samuel had spoken to her all those years ago, the words that had given her hope when she had none left. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howled and snow fell across West Texas, old-timers would tell the story of Margaret and Samuel, of the blizzard that brought them together, and the love that sustained them through 50 years of marriage. It became a local legend, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually doorways to something better, that rejection can be redirection, and that love can be found in the most unexpected places and the most desperate circumstances. The ranch that Samuel built and Margaret turned into a home passed down through the generations, remaining in the family for over 100 years. Each generation heard the story of how it all began, with a half-frozen woman stumbling out of a blizzard and a lonely cowboy who opened his door and his heart. It became part of the family mythology, a reminder of their roots and the courage it took to build something from nothing. And though the years passed, and the world changed in ways that Margaret and Samuel could never have imagined, their love story endured. It endured in the memories of their descendants, in the land they had worked so hard to build, in the values they had instilled in their children and grandchildren. It endured as proof that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst moments, that rejection can be the first step toward something better, and that love, real love, is worth every risk and every sacrifice. Margaret Riley had walked into a blizzard expecting to die, but instead she had found life. She had been rejected by a man who saw her as not good enough, but she had been chosen by a man who saw her as everything. And in the end, that made all the difference. That was the story she left behind, a story of hope and redemption and love that conquered all obstacles. A story that proved that sometimes, when everything falls apart, it is actually falling into place, leading you exactly where you need to be, to the person you are meant to find, to the life you are meant to live. Their story was complete, with no loose ends, no unresolved questions. Just a full and happy life, lived together, built on a foundation of mutual respect and deep love. Just a family that thrived and grew, spreading out across Texas and beyond, carrying with them the legacy of two people who had found each other in a storm and held on tight through all the storms that followed. Just a love that lasted, that endured, that became the stuff of legend not because it was perfect, but because it was real and true and chosen every single day for over 50 years. And that, in the end, was the greatest legacy of all.